what it would take. And there will be a comment and response by Kathy Christensen. And I think we can go ahead and turn things over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Becky. I decided to choose this lectern as opposed to that pulpit because I thought there was enough altitude to deal with, and this way I would be a bit closer to sea level. But I really want to thank you all very, very much for inviting me. I want to thank the organizers. I think it's one of the best organized conferences I've been at, actually, and I've been to a lot. And I especially want to thank Kathy, who was my point person throughout this long, long process of preparing for this conference, and kept us all very well informed, kept all the speakers very well informed about everything you had to face. And I know you had to face a lot, so you're really my heroes for proceeding with this conference as planned and getting it all done. So I've been asked to think about how we shape a different US policy towards the Palestinians and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I want to start by looking at three things. What we face, where we are today, and where we can go from here. Three things in terms of how we can shape a different US policy. First of all, in terms of what we face, I want to look at the policy interests of the US, of Israel, and of the Palestinians. So when it comes to the US, I guess our question is, what is the US policy in the Middle East? We know only too well, and to our cost, that the US considers the Middle East as really strategic to its interests, and has done so for decades. Among other things, it wants to be in a position to control developments in the Middle East, particularly in terms of oil and gas, and to keep its position of global predominance vis-à-vis China, especially vis-à-vis Russia today, much as it had tried to do vis-à-vis the Soviet Union and the spread of communism in the past. Now, there's no question at all that the Zionist lobby is very, very strong in the United States, as it is actually in Europe. But in some ways, the Zionist lobby really obscures the fact that the United States has very real strategic interests of its own. And in fact, in some ways, US policy gets a free pass thanks to Israel. Many people blame US policy on Israel. They find it difficult to believe that the US would behave as it does in the Middle East if it weren't for Israel. And so US policy as such doesn't really get closely examined enough as it should. Now, I referred to the Zionist lobby, and I wanted to say I'm using the term Zionist instead of pro-Israel or instead of the Jewish lobby, partly because there are many American Jews who are allies in the struggle for Palestinian human rights and for justice and equality for all. And I think it's hugely important in all our work never to use the term Jewish in any way that has any negative connotations or to conflate Judaism and Zionism. And I'm sure that most people in this room have at some point or another, I mean, you've all done work on this issue for a long time, and I'm sure at some point or another you've been pulled into a heated discussion about the dog and the tail, and who wags the tail, and who's the dog, and is America the dog, and Israel the tail that's wagging it. And I don't think this is a very helpful discussion. I think the fact is they're both dogs. I mean, they really are. And it's important that we understand what we're up against so as to be able to tackle it. And just to remind ourselves, just think back a moment to the way different US administrations have intervened or supported interventions in the Middle East, quite separately from the Zionist influence in the United States. A few examples, just a few, include the US role in the coup against the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister, Mossadegh, back in 1953, its landing of Marines in Lebanon in 1958, The bases it's maintained for decades in the Arab Gulf, first secretly and now openly. The decision to use military force rather than negotiations to evict Iraqi troops from Kuwait in 1990. And of course, its support over decades for dictatorial regimes in the Arab world that were friendly to its interests, despite what they did to the Arab peoples. So I think we really need to situate, in addition, so not only to look at US policy in and of itself in the region, but to situate US policy within the context of its aspirations in the rest of the world. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So we also need to situate US policy in the Middle East in the context of its aspirations in the rest of the world, which is well illustrated by its military footprint. As Chalmers Johnson wrote in TomDispatch.com back in 2004, and not much has changed since then, there's a vast network of American bases on every continent except Antarctica. And that constitutes a new form of empire. And the bases illustrate the size and nature of our imperial aspirations. Now, we in the Middle East are quite used to empires. And from our perspective, it looks simply as though the US empire took over where the British Empire left off. Of course, it manages its empire somewhat differently because we're in the modern age today. So my point is really that we need to recognize that there's a US policy independent of Israel that we also need to tackle. So that was in terms of what we faced the United States. So what do we face in terms of Israel? The Zionist movement has, since its earliest days, been extremely effective, brilliant in fact, of making use of any opportunity that presents itself to ensure that it was able to pursue its colonial ambitions in Palestine and its own sphere of influence in the region and control. And did that first with the British Empire, and then it now, and of course has been positioned with the US for decades, including as an ally in the Cold War, gaining in stature after the '67 war. So I don't need to tell this audience about the tools that Israel uses to get what it wants in the United States. They're well known to all of us. And they include a network of organizations directly or loosely affiliated with AIPAC that are focused on influencing congressional and presidential elections and maintaining a preeminent position in the media, in the think tanks, and on campuses so as to control the discourse, using money and/or smear tactics as necessary. We all know this, and many of you have been exposed to these tactics. Now, over the decades, the United States has sometimes slapped Israel on the wrist to try and stop some of the more extreme Israeli ambitions. But the only time that they've really stood in the face of Israel's ambitions is when they directly contradict US global ambitions. And I encourage you all to read a terrific policy brief that my colleague Osama Khalil wrote called The Myth of US Pressure. The Myth of US Pressure, and he wrote it for Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. I've left out some of the flyers. I spoke to some of you yesterday. Whoops. One moment. I rescue my water from the... So I spoke to some of you yesterday about Al-Shabaka. Al-Shabaka, which means simply the network, is a virtual think tank that a group of Palestinian thinkers and writers have co-founded to put a Palestinian voice, a policy voice especially, on the map, and to develop jointly strategies and policies together. And I'm really happy that we have some of the best thinkers and writers around, including Ali Abu Nameh, as he was one of the first to become a member of Al-Shabaka. So see me about this, pick up a copy of the flyer, and do join our email list. Now, in his policy brief, Osama discusses a pattern of American pressure, public American pressure, as well as private concessions to Israel that began as early as 1949. So publicly, America would speak up. Privately, it would make concessions to Israel. As early as 1949 at the Lausanne Conference, when the United States insisted that Israel repatriate a substantial number of Palestinian refugees, Israel not only refused, it also told the US that it planned to use tools at its disposal to achieve a change in the position of the US. It planned to use means available to them in the US to bring about a change in the US position. I'm sure that sounds very familiar to all of us here because nothing has really changed over the decades. Truman, the president at the time, was furious and warned Israel that the US might be forced to revise its attitude to Israel. And actually, at the time, the State Department suggested 4 tools that the administration, the US administration, could use to stop Israel flouting US wishes. And that included blocking the release of the remainder of a $100 million export-import loan, removing the tax-exempt status of Israel, of US-based Jewish groups to raise funds for Israel, refusing Israeli requests for technical assistance, and not supporting Israel at international organizations such as the UN. So of these options, Truman simply chose to delay the loan, but he only sustained that for a few months, and after that, the loan went ahead as normal. And this pattern has been repeated frequently over the years. I'm sure you can think of specific examples, like with the Clinton administration, with the Bush Senior administration, and so on. By contrast to these little slaps on the wrist that aren't sustained, when the US sees that its strategic interests are threatened, it successfully stops Israel's actions. For example, Eisenhower in 1956, when he demanded and got Britain and France to get the hell out of the Sinai. Ford and Kissinger in the '73 October War, when the Egyptian army was encircled by the Israeli army and Moscow threatened to intervene if there wasn't a ceasefire, and the US forced Israel to agree to a ceasefire. But even very recently, and not much is known about this, when Israel violated US restrictions on selling US technology to China, the Bush administration in 2005, I mean, we're talking about supposedly Israel's closest allies, the neocons, etc. The Bush administration in 2005 slapped stringent sanctions against Israel, really tough, insisted that it cancel the contract with China, insisted that it take a number of measures to undo the harm that it had done. And Israel was forced to do all that, and still the US did not resume business as usual in terms of arms and military relations with Israel. And Israel was effectively in a position of pleading with the US to come back to it. So that's just to illustrate the point that when US interests are directly threatened, it takes extremely forceful action, even administrations that are supposedly extremely closely allied with Israel. Okay, in addition, I think we need to remember that over the years, Israel has also served as a very useful ally to the US, if only as a bogeyman that helps keep the region both unstable and under enough control to serve both Israeli and US interests. Now, I believe the situation has been changing somewhat. Since the Bush Jr. administration made common cause with the neocons made common cause with the Israeli and American Zionists, and the Bush administration placed American troops directly in the Middle East in a conflict situation, first after 9/11, first in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq. And since then, we've seen public declarations by high-ranking military personnel about the dangers to US interests of Israel's actions in refusing to make peace with the Palestinians, even refusing to give the Palestinians the minimum that the Palestinian leadership was quite ready to settle for. And in the last several months, of course, we've seen Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's relentless efforts to push the US to war, and seeing how, with Iran, and seeing how this has led to pushback from US policy, diplomatic, and media quarters that normally don't speak out against Israel. And Netanyahu actually backtracked, as we saw in his talk at the UN. So it may be that Israel's ability to exert a strong influence on US policy is weakening. And we might get excited and think this is a really good thing until we remember what the US policy agenda is in the Middle East. And as I tried to explain, it has a policy agenda of its own that is not benign to the Middle East and not supportive, despite lip service to the contrary, not supportive of the human rights of the peoples of the Middle East. So I've talked, in terms of what we're facing, I've talked about US interests, Israeli interests. What about the Palestinians? And I think, and I want to add my voice to some of the speakers, including Ali, what about the Palestinians? One of the biggest obstacles to fulfilling Palestinian human rights is the terrible leadership that the Palestinians have had, and especially since the signing of the disastrous Oslo agreements. And the tragedy of the Oslo agreements is that they were launched at a time when the Palestinians were actually really strong. The first Intifada had put the Palestinian cause on the map in a way that everybody could see and hear and relate to, with clarity and power. And there was a very strong Palestine solidarity movement around the globe. So the Palestinians were strong, excuse me. But the Palestinian leadership signed the Oslo agreements, which were effectively, you know, an admission of defeat rather than being able to build on that strength. So, since '93, the Palestinian leadership has gone from weakness to weakness, leaving the way open to Israel to continue its colonization, fragmentation of land, and dispossession of the Palestinians, and to reduce the number of Palestinians living in Palestine. The Palestinian leadership, sadly, does not understand, nor does it nurture, the many sources of non-military power available to the Palestinians: political, diplomatic, legal, economic, media, and civil society. None of these does it invest in or nurtured. It's wasted huge opportunities like the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. And meanwhile, Palestinians and their allies have been left to their own devices to figure out what Palestinian goals and strategies are. And the real problem is that the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization are still recognized by the international community as the legal representative of the Palestinian people, even though they are not putting across really an effective Palestinian, making an effective Palestinian case for freedom, justice, and equality, and for putting these strategies on the policy agenda. So that's what we're facing. Now I want to move to what we're doing about it. I think I have about 15 minutes left, is that right? A little more? Okay, I won't take that much time. But, so what are we doing about it? After Oslo, sadly, a lot of the Palestinian civil society was NGOized, as Ali mentioned, and many people who were active in civil society also joined the government. And much of the international solidarity movement simply disbanded because with Oslo, people thought peace was at hand, and if this is what the Palestinian leadership wants, well, who are we to, like, you know, get in the way? Things began to change really after the year 2000. And Palestinians at home and abroad, as well as pro-peace and justice activists in the US, began to regroup and organize, given we noticed that Israeli occupation and dispossession was being entrenched by the Oslo Accords rather than being ended. So I just want us to think back, because we get disheartened. So it's such a tough struggle. We get disheartened in this moment. But let's think back to some of the things that have happened since the year 2000. Some of that reorganization that has taken place here in the States. The US movement Al-Awda for the Palestinian right of return was formed in the year 2000, even though it's had a number of organizational difficulties. They did bring refocus attention on the right of return. Electronic Intifada was established soon afterwards as a very powerful vehicle for communication of voices of justice. The US campaign to end the Israeli occupation began to take shape in 2001, actually well before the 9/11 attacks, to serve as an umbrella for the many national and local groups working for human rights on this issue. And it now has about 380 member groups, from the largest in the country to the smallest. Jewish Voice for Peace became a national organization by the mid-2000s, putting a very powerful Jewish voice for human rights out there. The Institute for Middle East Understanding was founded in 2005 to get the word out in the media. Friends of Sabeel, North America, has for years been bringing out the voice of Palestinian Christians and Palestinian rights overall. And Students for Justice in Palestine have regrouped as a national organization and held their first national conference last year, planning another one this year. These are just some of the national and local organizations that were formed or regrouped after the year 2000 here in the States, and they've joined other forces that have been active on these issues for years, such as the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the American Friends Service Committee, in the faith-based community, and Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and others. So it's not been plain sailing by any means. Funds, we don't have funds. Staffing issues are a problem. Points of unity are often points of disunity. There's been cooptation. There have been problems, but most of these organizations have stayed the course and focused on education and outreach, as well as on action and activism. So I think it's important to reflect. What have we learned, and what have we achieved? Here's a few lessons that I think we've learned. We've learned that to have an impact on this issue is going to take a long, long time. It really is. I mean, I remember when we were first forming the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, I said to my colleagues, oh, 5 years and we'll be done with this, and we can all go back home. And the younger members of the campaign said, oh, it's going to take 20 to 30 years. You're just being way too optimistic. And of course, here we still are. We've started from such a low base of information and a very high base of misinformation about our issues. So it's going to take a long time, but we mustn't get disheartened, even though it's so very hard. We've learned that unless we can really bring significant money and significant votes to the table, we can't yet sway large numbers of elected officials. We've learned that we need to stay on track and not necessarily change our strategies in terms of our education, outreach, and activism, but to change our tactics when needed. For example, to shift some of our congressional organizing work from the national, to the district level, to the local level, and to work with elected representatives at the local level. And we've actually achieved a lot. We finally started to score victories in areas that we've been working on for years. Ali's mentioned some of those yesterday, like Caterpillar, important boycott resolutions in the Methodist and Presbyterian churches, divestment actions by the American Friends Service Committee. And I served on the American Friends Service Committee Middle East Committee several years ago, about a decade ago. And I remember when they first began, the Middle East staff introduced the idea of an investment screen on Israel-Palestine, and there was, apprehension in the organization. But those staff pushed ahead, and the organization pushed ahead, and here we are, 10 years later, from those early tentative days, 10 years later, in 1 year, Friends Fiduciary divested from Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, and Motorola. Plus, separately, Caterpillar, thanks to all the work that everybody who's been working on Caterpillar has been doing over the years, Caterpillar has now been removed from Morgan Stanley Socially Responsible Index, with TIAA-CREF divesting soon after. This, of course, causes the companies some pain. It causes Israel much, much greater pain as it sees the beginning of an effective challenge to its ability to control the discourse and to control activism in the United States. And it gives us power and energy, a sense that we can continue. And we've been shifting the discourse. Pro-Palestinian and Palestinian voices are far better represented in the media than ever before, thanks in large part to, well, your activism and people writing, but also to the Institute for Middle East Understanding, who helps people place stuff in the media. And there are far more Jewish voices speaking up for freedom, justice, and equality. In the old days, we used to react to events. Now, we're setting the agenda in many ways, and the Zionists are reacting to us, whether it's at conferences, in the media, or on campus. And even in mainstream political parties, such as the Democratic Convention, when we saw that language on Jerusalem as the capital of Israel had to be forced into the platform despite huge objections from the floor. We're also, I think, these days much better able to identify our allies and resources. For example, the very important pro bono legal support that helped secure the victory, enabling the Olympia Food Co-op to move ahead with the decision to boycott Israeli goods. And I think from my perspective as a Palestinian, perhaps the most, and this is not in the, I'm going to speak not about something that we've achieved in the United States, but about something the Palestinians have achieved as Palestinians. The most important achievement is that we now have the guidance of a national body, the BDS National Committee, BNC. Ali has spoken a bit about it yesterday. I just want to explain why it's so important for me as a Palestinian and for our cause. The BNC has managed, since the civil society call was issued in 2005, the BNC now has managed to bring together all the leading Palestinian national and Islamic voices, political forces, as well as leading civil society organizations. They don't meet anywhere else. Hamas and Fatah are at loggerheads. There's such political fragmentation, yet they're all at within the BNC, and they take decisions by consensus. And what the BNC does now is provide guidance, not by any means imposing, providing guidance globally on how to use the BDS strategy to fulfill the Palestinian goals. And I think most importantly, it's defined what those Palestinian goals should be, are and should be. How do we know when our struggle is over? When do we know when to pack up and go home? Not when something like the Oslo Accords are signed. No, when we have achieved self-determination, freedom from occupation, justice for Palestinian refugees, and equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And those are the Palestinian goals, vision and goals, and it is a call, the call to action also invited all Israelis of conscience to speak, to join this movement and to be part of it. So I want to underscore that the BNC, though, is not the national leadership of the Palestinian people. That has to be something else. The BNC is about a strategy. But it at least helps to really fill the leadership vacuum in which the Palestinians and their supporters have been working for the last 20 years. And it's a smart, strategic leadership that's learning lessons as it forges ahead. So I think, without being naive or optimistic, I do think we're in a much stronger place than we were a decade ago. We've become a force to be reckoned with. Now, we're still a very disparate and under-resourced force, but we are a force, and we have enough support. We're building, we are working in all these areas, and the day may not be too far away when we change the discourse enough, and we have enough support at the local and district level such that elected representatives stand behind our cause instead of standing behind Israel. And more choose to divest from Israel, to boycott Israeli goods, and leading on to sanctions and ending military aid to Israel. So that's what we face, what we've achieved, what we've learned, what we've done. And so what more can we do? What can we do to bring this day closer when we see peace and justice in this cause that we care about? Here are just a few thoughts to summarize like what I put out there. First, reshaping US policy towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict means recognizing that there is a US policy distinct from, although still largely allied to, Israel's policies. And that means in our education and outreach, we really need to put US Middle East policy in the context of global US policy. It means allying with forces for change that seek to reshape US policy globally and not just in the Middle East. For example, movements for nuclear disarmament, against military bases, now against drones, and so on, in addition to our traditional allies. And it means linking foreign and domestic policy to ally with those forces for change at home, for justice and human rights within the United States, such as the Occupy movement. And I think we haven't been doing as good a job in this area as we should have been. We can perhaps do more, and we can learn from Students for Justice in Palestine, the SJP groups, because in a lot of their work on campus, they have multi-issue, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith coalitions to work on Palestine, and that means then working with those other groups on their issues. And they have alliances that are truly two-way and not one-sided. So first, US policy in the Middle East in its global context. Second, we need to scale up, really scale up what we've been doing to reclaim and change the discourse. We faced something of a setback in the past year when Israel hijacked the discourse and focused it on Iran. I mean, it's been so hard to get stuff in the media about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And so it very intelligently pushed the discourse on Iran and used it as a camouflage for its colonization of the West Bank and its dispossession. We need to find ways to counter this intelligently, finding entry points that widen the divergence between Israel and the United States when their interests diverge, such as on Iran. But we need to do this in a way that is principled and upholds human rights and does not fall into the trap of advancing a global American agenda that goes against our values. Now, changing the discourse, I think, is really one of the keys to success. That's why I emphasize it, because when people start thinking differently, they start acting differently. Third, the Arab uprisings against dictatorship for freedom and dignity. Uprisings that have, yes, taken very different paths. They've created opportunities for us that so far, actually, Israel and the US have been better at exploiting than we have. You know, at a minimum for Israel, fragmented Arab peoples are much easier to control. And Israel has also used the focus on the uprisings, you know, and what's going on in Syria, et cetera, to also cloak its colonization and dispossession. But the Arab uprisings have really changed the kaleidoscope in the region. We have a different approach in Egypt now, for example, and they've provided us with an opportunity to question US policy in the region as a whole, not just towards Israel and the Palestinians. And finally, I think in the absence of a strategic Palestinian national leadership that has the capacity and the will to muster and guide diplomatic, political, economic, and civil society forces, we need to listen to those Palestinians who those Palestinian bodies who uphold the goals of the civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions for Israel. Those goals provide a guiding light for all our work in a time of national disarray. And I just want to conclude by saying that I feel confident that our combined energies, resources, and abilities will carry us forward to a day when we recognize that it's a long haul, but if we stay strong, and we stay strong in the cause of justice, we will see it achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Shukran jazilan. And I'd like to introduce Kathy Christensen. Let me get get the last name right there. And she'll provide a comment and response here.
This is a tough thing. I think you should have the floor to yourself, but somebody assigned me to do this. So my thing is U.S. policy, so I would like to concentrate mostly on what you said about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, what it means for policy, and the influence of the pro-Israel lobby. And I would like to, for purposes of discussion primarily, but also, this is, I think, what I believe, I would like to challenge you a little bit on your interpretation of the extent of U.S. independence from Israeli policy. Andrew Bacevich, who's I think a fairly well-known commentator, a former military man, commentator since 9/11 on U.S. policy, foreign policy, military policy, and so on, just recently wrote an article in the American Conservative magazine, not something I normally read, but somebody sent me his article, and the title of the article, and I'm not sure I have this exactly right, is something to the effect of how we became Israel. How we have become Israel. Maybe it's a question, when did we become Israel? And the theme of his article is how much we follow Israeli policy and Israeli tactics, Israeli drone attacks. And Lynn Gottlieb in the last workshop mentioned, and I think this is fairly well known, that the company that is building the wall on the U.S.-Mexican border is also the company that's building the wall in Palestine, the Israeli wall in Palestine. And although you said you think, and I hope this is true, that U.S. generals, and I know this is true, some of this has gotten out quite publicly, that U.S. generals are worried that we are too close to Israel. But at the same time, I think that the U.S. military, really follows Israeli policy. I also think that you said that the U.S. is independent when its interests are directly threatened. That has certainly been the case, at least so far, in our ability so far to get Israel, to induce Israel not to attack Iran. And thank God for that kind of that much independence. But I wonder, when you say that that the United States is independent when its interests are directly threatened, independent of Israel, do you not believe, and this is just a matter of nuance, I realize, but it's a very significant nuance. I think that our alliance with Israel, the $3 billion at least in military aid we give Israel every year, the fact that we enable the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, we have enabled Israel's occupation of Palestine since 1948, I think Barack Obama has been totally spineless in his relationship with Israel. The settlements have expanded drastically since Obama took over. They had been expanding drastically before that. So I guess my belief is that our relationship with Israel in Palestine is very detrimental to United States interests. It, I think, is one of the things that has led to these anti-American demonstrations throughout the Middle East. So could you just comment on that? I just don't quite think that the U.S. is as independent as you have portrayed, but I grant all of the things you have said. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Those are great comments and great questions. Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. The U.S. has completely enabled Israel's occupation, hasn't stood behind it, hasn't stood up to it, even though there have been weak attempts that haven't sustained, you know, as I explained. And it's true that Israel, I mean, in a sense, that the US military uses things that Israel has tested out. Israel uses Gaza especially, and the occupied Palestinian territories to test out a whole range of new military technology and devices and so on. I just, and yes, I agree with you that the US support of Israel is detrimental to, let me put it somewhat differently, is detrimental to its perhaps its longer-term interests in the Arab world, is very detrimental to the way Arabs view America, feel about America. But what I wanted to try and say is that America can live with this, you know, can live with this. These are problematic issues, but so long as they don't directly threaten US global strategic interests, it can live with them. So we think that, I mean, why can't they see how bad their policies are in the region, how people feel about them, how people demonstrate against them, how people will turn against the administration? Because, I mean, people still like Americans as a people when you go to the Middle East, I think people. Why don't they stop that? Why don't they do something about it? Yes, it's politically expensive to stand up to Israel, and Israel makes sure that it stays that way. But at the same time, I do think the example I cited of what Bush Jr. administration did to Israel over its arms sales to China, when it was extremely forceful, and it went on over a period of a year and a half to 2 years, and had it take a number of measures, you know, and withheld all kinds of military technology from it. I mean, this is in its superpower competition with China. No, there was no way. And these are supposed to be the spineless, supine, you know, closest allies to Israel. When Israel got in the way of their strategic interests, they slapped it down. And it came back pleading. I mean, it was actually a quote, I believe, in the New York Times, that, look, we've done everything they've wanted. You know, we've canceled the contract, we've done this, they've done that. They still don't want to talk to us. What more can we do? You know, when so Israel is extremely useful to the United States. Yes, it controls the United States policy to a point, but that's because the US does not attach that, okay, it's a problem, but it's not unmanageable. But it's also extremely useful to the United States. Yeah, the US uses the drones and the testing, for example, in Iraq, it used a lot of what Israel, they used the torture tactics that Israel used, you know, and many other things. They've been tested, and actually in Israel, on the Palestinians, Israel is actually marketing them not just to the US, but to other countries, you know, as part of its sales pitch. So I just want us to, I mean, without, you know, I mean, I think we're pretty much on the same page. I just want us to understand that the US has a policy of its own in the region, and you know, we can see it, you know, from, I mean, its military bases, and it has its strategic interests. Israel so far has been one of them. The challenge for us is, how do we widen that divergence between Israel and the US? But at the same time, also make sure that we change a US policy overall that is based on such, you know, global and military dominance.
Thank you. I think we should let this
Do we have time for questions? Or?
So we have a little bit of time for questions. If we have any, what we'll do is we'll have you come up to the mic that's in the center here. So we'll start with absolutely the most, we've got her. And then actually, if you'd like, you can line up, I think, and then we'll hopefully be able to get to everybody.
I had to come quickly because otherwise I'd forget my question or comment. It's very brief.
And I have to write it down because otherwise I'll forget it too. So.
I think that the issue that you talked about was very true. I think that the problem is, at this point in the United States history, and perhaps forever, we have not concerned ourselves with human interests as a strategic interest as much as economic and military issues.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Are you going to take a few questions?
Yeah, I'll take all of the questions at once. And
well,
then,
in the U.S. global interest, U.S. policy globally, there seems to be a recent statement by the administration and our government saying that they're going to refocus from the Middle East and have more focus on Southeast Asia. Now, that may be obvious because of China, but can you maybe unbundle what implications that might have in terms of our interest in the Middle East? And then as it comes to Palestinian leadership, what happened to Hanan Ashrawi?
In the last workshop with Jeff Halper, he was pointing out how tied the U.S. and Israel is in the development of military and defense, weaponry, and so forth. So I'm not sure. In fact, I probably don't agree with you that. I mean, I think the Bush administration war on terrorism, we're continuing that as an ongoing policy in the United States. So in terms of a capitalist, industrial, big industry kind of policy that the United States is controlled by, I think it's very similar and in conjunction or in cooperation with Israel. So I don't see much of a divergence there, and maybe you might comment on that.
Sort of following up on that comment, the discussion about really whether it is the tail that's wagging the dog or the dog that's wagging the tail, I strongly agree that it is the tail that's wagging the dog. And Kathleen Christensen, if any of you haven't seen it, has a number of excellent articles about the neocon connection to the invasion of Iraq. They're on our website, If Americans Knew, and I'd just like to point out there are a few other organizations that have been working for a long time on the issue. Council for the National Interest has been working on it for 20 years, the Washington Report for Middle East Affairs for 30 years, and If Americans Knew for about 12 years. And we are about to, this is 1 minute, launch what we hope will be a national campaign to stop aid to Israel that local community activists can fit into and will run. There probably won't be time, I was hoping for time later today, but there probably won't be time for me to talk about it. So anybody that's interested, please come to me. You can see the checks that we're using. It's called Stop the Blank Check to Israel campaign. And anybody that's interested, please talk to me later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, for your comments. I think they were wonderful. I wanted to reemphasize how frustrating it is to lobby at the grassroots level, our representatives, and try to excite their moral compass on this issue in the face of vast financial resources against us. But I agree with you, we can't give up. We have to continue on the path. I want to take you out of the realm of speaking a little bit, if I can, from what we can do here to bringing in a different factor, and that is the Arab governments. The idea of how we can influence those governments to have more leverage on the United States and the relationship with the United States, and remind the White House of the Palestinian issue. I think the Arab governments are not doing enough on that issue, and I wonder if you can speak to that issue. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you all. Those are really great, very interesting questions. Yeah, I agree that the U.S. hasn't, okay. So I have 5 minutes to answer them, but I probably won't take that long anyway. Yes, I agree that U.S. policy or the U.S. and successive U.S. administrations have focused on, global dominance rather than human rights for a very long time. So The question about the refocus to Southeast Asia away from the Middle East is a very interesting one. You know, I've always thought that if we were Latin America, if we didn't have oil, we wouldn't be of such interest to anyone, and we could just get on with our development. And I mean, obviously, I know several countries in Latin America have oil, but if we would have been able to develop in the same way that Latin America has been developing in terms of getting rid of military dictatorships and be, you know, have more democratic government. And I don't know. It may be that the shift to Southeast Asia may have less pressure on having Arab governments toe the line, or, you know, more independence for peoples to express their opinion in the Arab world or to act. I don't know. We need to look at places like Bahrain and Qatar to see how deeply entrenched the US is in terms of its military bases, its forces, and its strategies in those countries, and the many other sort of bases it's dotting around the Middle East. So I think it may be Southeast Asia as well as the Middle East, as well as everywhere else, rather than just that refocus. Hanan Ashawi stayed at home. I mean, when I say stayed at home, she, when Oslo was signed, she used the opportunity to build organizations at home for Palestinian rights and justice. So she no longer played as much of a role as a spokesperson and representative of the Palestinians as she had previously. And of course, anyone who works within the framework of the PLO and the PA now, their room for maneuver is very constrained by that. But she remains a very clear thinker and fantastic speaker whenever one can. I'm glad you're doing a campaign on to end stop aid to Israel, Alison. I want to also draw attention, and those who were in the workshop this morning with Josh Rubner know it. The U.S. campaign has a huge number of resources on ending U.S. military aid to Israel, and it's been working on that issue for many years now. And it's taking it to the level now of city councils, and that's what I mean about learning lessons. If you hit a brick wall with the congressional reps, okay, maybe start at the city council level, get the city council to pass a resolution to end military aid to Israel. So I encourage you to check out those resources at endtheoccupation.org. And about the Arab governments, yeah, you know, it's not going to be easy to convince the Arab governments to pay that much attention to the issue, although I think Egypt is the most receptive, and we heard it in the Egyptian President Morsi's speech to the UN that, you know, there might be a pivot there in terms of really trying to refocus attention on human rights for Palestinians. And he actually challenged what people are saying about, oh, will the Egyptians live up to their commitments under Camp David, you know, with Israel? What the Egyptians are going to do? Israel says, well, Camp David has another part to it that's not been fulfilled, that provides, you know, Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories, and we would, and for Palestinian human rights, of course, in the context of autonomy, and we would like to see that happen too. And I think what the Arab Spring has done is make Arab governments realize they have to be more accountable to public opinion. There is a public opinion. There's been a lot of investment in education in the Arab world. There's now a very well-informed public opinion that's not scared to speak up. So both the Arab governments and the US are going to have to listen to that and take note of that. But still, for example, in the case of Egypt, look at what happens on the ground. What is is Egypt going to open Rafah, the Rafah border, make it less difficult for Palestinians to be able to get in and out, break the siege on Gaza? You know, let's keep our eye on the ground and see what happens there before we take a decision. But certainly the Arab Spring or uprisings, it's hardly a spring, but the Arab uprisings offer new opportunities that we need to take advantage of. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Nadia Hijab for her wonderful information and sharing. And I'd like to call Danya Mustafa up yet again and Bradley to give some details about the workshop they have for lunch. Thank you again.
Okay. Hello again. We just want to remind you that we're having a workshop during lunch. It's going to be in the East Room. So if you would like, after you get your food, we have some tables set up for you to sit and eat. Unfortunately, it probably will not hold every single person, but as much people to come, we would love it just to hear what the youth have to say. And we are the fastest growing movement in Palestine solidarity, and so, you know, we feel that our voice should be heard, so thank you.